Comparing Gojo with other powerful shonen stories and trying to power scale the quote-unquote strongest, you're gonna realize pretty quickly that outside of Jujutsu Kaisen, it's a very scary place for Satoru Gojo when talking about power scaling. This is pretty much exactly how this video right here started, where I compared Gojo's Infinity to other insanely OP techniques, but mostly in shonen. Obviously, Gojo doesn't just get one-tapped and blown away by absolutely anybody, but that's also just because of Infinity. I wasn't really rage baiting, and okay, maybe it was a little bit satire when I said that he might have scaled to Demon Slayer, but seriously, without Infinity, this guy's rival is a Cyberman if the Cyberman was sick, disabled, tired, beaten up. When your strongest attack used to be considered existence erasure by the community, but is now looked at as some big purple glorified ki blast, nothing could really get much worse besides your verse being forever locked and dodging Mach 3 allegations and only lightning timers at best. But you don't have to worry if you're a Gojo fan. Just argue that they can't bypass Infinity and it's GG. That's because Infinity is rooted in real-world mathematics, and that means nearly everybody is stopped by Gojo's Infinity. If you don't use techniques that can bypass or shut down his Limitless altogether, you're pretty much cooked without infinite speed. That's pretty much the entire idea behind making this video right here, but obviously not everybody who can bypass Infinity was included in the video. Would the Death Note actually work against Gojo? Could Sonic or Wally West just outrun the Limitless? And yes, for all those wondering, I'll actually talk about Infinity Stone LeBron versus Gojo, but if you like hearing about Kakashi, Goku, and even Alien X, then you should stick around till the end of the video. It's annoying, but I'm gonna have to start off this video explaining Gojo's curse technique first, and it's also even more annoying because I have to tell you guys to subscribe because 99% of you guys who watch these videos just aren't subscribed for some reason, and also leave a like on the video because that really matters more than anything else. Infinity is the golden scar of Gojo's arsenal. It's the core of his curse technique, which is essentially just high-tier spatial manipulation. Satoru Gojo's Limitless is his curse technique, which is basically just the JJK version of your Kekkei Genkai quirk or breathing style. However, instead of being exclusive to one family or being taught, there's only one person who can utilize the Limitless curse technique, and that's Satoru Gojo, and it's all because of his six eyes. Gojo's six eyes can manipulate space and manipulate cursed energy on an atomic level. Many times in the manga, Infinity is called the neutral Limitless. There's some debate on if Infinity is actually some type of barrier, but that does seem to be consistent. Toji slices through Infinity using the inverted Spear of Heaven, and it does seem to be more like this barrier or even a bubble-like protective layer. Once objects or entities enter the barrier surrounding Gojo containing the Infinity, that's where we can start explaining why the neutral Limitless is the infinite division of space. Infinity is something naturally around everyone, and Gojo says that he's just bringing this concept into reality. You can't see Infinity, and this confuses opponents who can't understand why it clearly appears like they're making contact with Gojo, but in reality there's virtually an infinite distance to cross before you even begin making contact. You'll understand Infinity much better after hearing the example within the manga itself from a story called Achilles and the Tortoise. Achilles, who's the runner, attempts to chase after this tortoise, but there's one catch. Whenever Achilles gets close to the tortoise, he only ends up crossing half of the distance. This is paradoxical, and there's never any way to keep crossing half of the distance and reach zero because there's always going to be half of something left. If you keep dividing any positive number by half or 0.5, you're going to keep getting another positive value in return. In Gojo's case, he's doing this quite literally, but with space. As you cross deeper, you're only crossing half of the distance like Achilles and the tortoise. You'll get closer, but never complete, and that's Infinity because you can't ever reach your destination if half of the distance is still always left to cross. Since discovering the reverse curse technique in positive energy, which allows Gojo to heal his body from damage during combat, it can also assist with removing mental strain on his brain. Over time, concentrating on using his technique is pretty draining. You'll definitely get tired on focusing on using your cursed energy for days on end. That's exactly what happened before Gojo completely solved this issue using the reverse curse technique. His six eyes, which is just basically JJK's own version of dojutsu, allows Gojo to manipulate his cursed energy far more precisely than any other sorcerer, including Ryomen Sukuna. These eyes do more than just increase his efficiency, but also allow his brain to function at high speeds, and probably explains how he can multitask using the reverse curse technique around the clock. This keeps his brain fresh at all times. Until he passes away from hunger or old age, Gojo can keep Infinity active completely automatically. He's also created his own automatic targeting system for this technique, and Gojo's Infinity works completely passively, which means that he can assign a threat level based on mass, speed, shape, and cursed energy, and automatically have Infinity protect him from anything deemed a threat, which means that Gojo basically never has to manually activate this technique, which is problematic even for those who are much faster than Gojo. Gojo's 6 eyes also make his usage of cursed energy extremely efficient, which means that unlike other sorcerers who waste a bunch of cursed energy activating curse techniques, Gojo only uses an infinitesimal amount, and infinitesimal in mathematics is the smallest number which isn't 0. It would be something like 0.000, and that would go on almost infinitely with just a 1 at the end. It's an extremely small figure, and it's really close to 0, but it's not 0. So just giving the final recap, in short, infinity stops anything by slowing it down and forcing the object into traveling against the infinite dividing space the closer they get to Gojo. His 6 eyes make sure that he'll never run out of cursed energy to power the technique, and it's fully automatic, so even dangerous objects don't need Gojo to completely stop them. So now the question is, which methods can actually bypass the infinity that I didn't already go over in the other video? Firstly, there's speedsters running right through infinity. It's the obvious method for bypassing infinity, but some people are still pretty skeptical. You'd be surprised by just about how many people doubt that even with infinite speed, you still wouldn't be fast enough to cross into and exit the infinity, but the answer to that has always been pretty obvious. Like I've mentioned before in that entire Yap session that I just went on about infinity, infinity is the infinite division of space. Gojo's virtually and sorta literally putting an infinite distance between himself and his opponent. That's also pretty much exactly how the manga describes it, so with that in mind, in theory, you should be able to outrun even an infinite distance with infinite speed. Now obviously this has never been done within the series, but that's because nobody in Jujutsu Kaisen will ever get close to being anywhere near infinite speed. But even without seeing this theory in action and in practice, it logically does follow. People argue that just raw speed probably wouldn't work because once you enter the barrier and begin interacting with infinity, infinity slows you down and then stops you completely. It is true that infinity slows you down as you cross into the infinite distance, but this really isn't a good counter argument. Even your local smooth brain with room temperature IQ can still deduce that if you're slowing down infinite speed, it's still going to be infinite even if the speed is decreasing. Mathematically, half of infinity would still be infinite, and that's literally the backbone of Gojo's technique in action. You can understand infinite speed as being capable of crossing an infinite distance within finite time. That's pretty much the standard definition, and bringing the concept of infinity into reality between himself and others won't stop those who are already fast enough to cross infinite distances even if you are slowing them down. Crossing through time would put many speedsters like Barry Allen at something that we call immeasurable speed. This would be considered higher than infinite speed because it literally breaks the speed formula, which would be speed equals distance divided by time. If you're moving through something like the Speed Force and traveling across time, then it would be impossible to use the speed formula since you're literally traveling through time. Other speedsters like the Reverse Flash and Wally West, just like Barry Allen, would run straight through Gojo's infinity. This video really isn't about how fast each of these speedsters are, so even if you're skeptical about using feats like traveling through time to say that they're immeasurable speed, you still have some of Wally's higher feats like traveling across the infinite universe faster than somebody with instant teleportation. This feat really doesn't even make any sense. Like, how are you outrunning somebody who has instant movement, but whatever. There's also multiple versions of Sonic ranging from both canon and non-canon material that can all just run straight through infinity. You could argue that Sonic reaching the end of the corridor, which was stated to have been warped into an infinite space within this guide, would grant him infinite speed. But it's also contentious because of how it's portrayed when realizing that you can literally count how many steps it took Sonic to reach this end of the corridor. Personally, I would just argue that the developers blatantly can't code or display somebody talking about infinite steps or infinite movement without some type of symbol or statement. But then again, running through the infinite space is probably one of the most simplest win cons against Gojo, and running straight through infinity might be the funniest. In Dragon Ball Super, Beerus and Goku clash, and the shockwaves went far past the normal world and into the Kai world where we see Supreme Kai and Elder Kai. This was just normal punches with Goku and Super Saiyan God and Beerus massively holding back, but that's not really that crazy. The craziest thing is that it reached the world of the Kais from Earth. Within the Dragon Ball macrocosm, at least for Universe 7, this planet is far outside the observable universe, which could be argued infinite in size. This really does depend on your interpretation, and that's a whole debate within itself, but for the sake of this video, the Dragon Ball universe is actually infinite. Normal ki attacks as strong as the shockwaves created by Goku and Beerus would cross through infinity, as they've already been shown crossing through an infinite distance within finite time like the speedsters. This argument is pretty contentious as there's many reasons to question Universe 7 being truly infinite mathematically, but most people generally are pretty skeptical about the exact definition of infinite, at least within this context, as it could just mean very large or very great. It really does depend on some of your interpretations interpretations because some of the contentions are pretty ridiculous, like people who genuinely argue that because we can visualize the macrocosm on paper, therefore it wouldn't be truly infinite because we can visualize both ends. But then again, like most things generally, it really does come down to your own interpretation because this video isn't meant to be discussing if the Dragon Ball universe is truly infinite. Janemba was capable of warping space and punching through these tiny portals, which have been shown on larger scales to cross through dimensions like the living world and the afterlife. This would basically act as a shortcut straight through infinity. In the anime, Gotenks charging up his ki was already warping reality, while him and Super Buu create their own portal from the hyperbolic time chamber back to Earth, which has been stated to be another dimension multiple times. You could get carried away arguing something like instant transmission would work against Gojo's infinity, which it probably wouldn't, but that's because the barrier encasing infinity is extremely skin tight and would probably move with Gojo, and considering it works on an atomic level, I really highly doubt that Goku can instant transmission into infinity. But overall, arguing that opening portals through infinity like Gotenks and Janemba are probably your safest methods for bypassing Gojo's infinity, while you could sort of say that the highball scaling in this context would be arguing something like the ki attacks on the level of Super Saiyan God Goku is already traveling an infinite distance within finite time and therefore would work past infinity. But then again, you're really free to comment what you think down below. I'd figure I'd mention this right here after discussing Dragon Ball, but one common counter that you'll hear for Infinity is Saitama. Obviously not literally Saitama himself, but his punch. You shouldn't let yourself be tricked into thinking that he's your average striker and punch god merchant, because these aren't ordinary punches. Saitama's pretty much guaranteed method for bypassing Gojo's Infinity would be his Causality punch. This attack takes him back into the nearby past where Saitama's punch lands before it was ever actually released. I really don't understand it, but somehow the one punch god merchant not only reversed time, but causality itself. The example from within the series that I think is actually the most similar that you're gonna get to Saitama's causality punch would be sure hit attacks from domain expansions, which literally don't exist until the moment they attack you. Obviously, domain expansions neutralize curse techniques through sure hit attacks and not speed, but that also doesn't change the fact and the result of Gojo being hit straight in the face even with infinity if a causality punch by Saitama manages to be launched. I'll say it again just to make sure, but infinity can't stop something that's not in motion or even in existence. You could argue though on the other hand that Saitama probably wouldn't be able to recreate this punch. He only really pulled it off against Garo because he was emotionally distressed and he was thinking about Genos literally dying. He continues to grow in his fight against Garo exponentially, and we even get this graph right here depicting that. Causality punch would work against infinity, but if Saitama has the speed or the attack potency to actually pull it off, and that's going to be a discussion for another video. Existence erasure is the second most simplest method for taking down Satoru Gojo's infinity, and it's also the only method actually used within the series that didn't just disable infinity altogether like Jogo's domain amplification. In chapter 236, Sukuna used Maharaga's adaptation to crack the secret into ripping in not just Satoru Gojo but also infinity. He realized that he would need to use dismantle and aim for a different target, because as of right now he's only been aiming for Gojo or infinity, but why not the world itself? That's when Sukuna awakened the world cutting slash, which is basically just his normal dismantle but with one key difference. He's not just cutting down objects within his path, but space itself. Sukuna figured that because infinity obviously would exist within space, destroying the area containing infinity would also permanently erase the greatest defense from the equation. So in short, it's just Sukuna using the world cutting slash to destroy space, and a lot of people like to say that this is existence erasure, but in reality it's just Sukuna destroying space, and it's not like something like Beerus using Hakai, which would completely destroy Gojo's soul. But the reason why I say it's a good example and proof that existence erasure would work on infinity is because anybody with true existence erasing hacks can obviously also destroy space, which would in turn destroy infinity. Ripping through space and Gojo altogether is probably the most lethal option for taking him down, and there's actually many characters with this ability who can all do something similar. You've already seen me explain that Beerus using Hakai can probably break down infinity, but another character which nobody should really be surprised by is the Omni King. Zeno can pretty much effortlessly erase entire universes and space itself. He's obviously stronger than Beerus and the other gods of destruction, who all fear Zeno's ability to wipe them from existence. We're not exactly told what ability the Omni King possesses which can completely erase entire universes, but I'm sure this technique is more powerful than Hakai, which can already easily erase infinity. There are some contentious showings like Zeno destroying future Trunks' timeline, but oxygen still seems to be present when Goku arrives, but that's a topic for another video. video. You can comment down below what you think. Anyone who knows anything about Alien X and Ben 10 would say that him ripping through Gojo's infinity is the obvious answer. Not only would he count as one of the characters who can run through Gojo's infinity since he's infinite speed, Alien X can pretty much do whatever he wants, and that's literally been stated by the author when reaffirming that this is Ben's most powerful upgrade. He can completely bend all time and space to his will, making tearing holes in Gojo's infinite division of space one of his many win conditions around infinity. Alien X can also just start reality warping away infinity, but I'll be covering that later. But overall, Alien X has a ton of options for getting rid of infinity, including existence erasure. You've already heard me explain this before, but you could also make infinity virtually non-existent by just reality warping. Those with the ability to change reality itself by bending the rules on levels both physical and metaphysical would make Gojo's infinity pretty much powerless. Alien X clearly wouldn't have any issues, but I've already done enough yapping about Ben 10, and this section is going to be reserved for the GOAT Infinity Stone LeBron. Unironically, and being totally honest, while being completely genuine, like I can't stress this enough, LeBron with the gauntlet would tear right through infinity. Normally the meme has LeBron's arsenal stacked with the Chaos Emeralds, 100 years of prep time, the Infinity Gauntlet with all 5 stones, and he's back in his prime with no bad coaches or teammates. But I'll just be talking about LeBron with the Infinity Gauntlet, since anything else is probably overkill, especially putting LeBron back in his prime. But even then, if you take even just one of the 5 stones on the gauntlet, being the Reality Stone, you're easily tearing through infinity. We've already seen it use high-level reality warping within the MCU, and if you wanted to take the animated Marvel What If series, the Reality Stone was completely altering the race of the bystanders watching this Ultron fight, even arguing that the Reality Stone has mostly been used to create illusions and not actual physical changes to reality itself. LeBron could potentially make some Itachi level genjutsu which could trick Gojo into disabling infinity himself. There's tons of debate on if illusions would work in JJK, but they don't mostly work due to the power system and issues equalizing both verses like in the case with genjutsu, but you wouldn't be able to make the same counter argument against the Reality Stone warping reality and creating illusions, because Gojo's already been seen susceptible to illusions even by far weaker characters like Hanami, which just overall makes it worse for Gojo. LeBron would also have access to the Space Stone and Soul Stone, but you get the point. You could also argue that some abilities that have life manipulation properties would also work, but not in all cases. The first ability that comes to mind would be using something like the Death Note. Using the Death Note is pretty simple. Write the target's name within the pages and watch your target flatline. Using the Death Note is something that pretty much anybody can do, and it's very simple. Obviously, you'll need to know the person's name first, but that should be pretty easy because everybody knows who Satoru Gojo is, to the point where Yuji pretending like he never even heard of the guy was suspicious enough according to Akari. Light Yagami living in Japan means that he'd eventually hear about the most famous sorcerer to ever live the minute he begins investigating supernatural powers after receiving the Death Note. The bottom line is that it really wouldn't be fun if he doesn't know Gojo's name, so let's just assume that Light Yagami knows how to spell and who exactly Satoru Gojo is. When it comes to people like Goku, you could normally argue that because he's a Saiyan and not human and that he's literally an alien, that it wouldn't work because one of the explicitly stated rules is about the Death Note only working on humans. Although Gojo is in fact human, and this wouldn't be a problem for Light, and the real issue I want to bring up is another rule about needing to picture the person's face. One of the first rules in the section of the book blatantly called the tutorial says that this note will not take effect unless the writer has the face of the person in mind when writing his or her name. Normally this wouldn't be an issue for someone like Yurihime who doesn't like Gojo and still wants him gone, but that's only because she can easily picture his ugly face. Now this is gonna sound obvious, but if you really think about it, Light can't picture Gojo's face because he's always wearing his blindfold. You can argue that he might be able to imagine his face without the blindfold because it really shouldn't be that different, but the issue is imagining his eyes, which are highly unlikely. Maybe if Gojo had typical eyes, but he's literally the only person in the world with the 6 eyes, and from my knowledge there's no pictures that Light could access. Maybe the very general picture that Light could picture even with Gojo wearing the blindfold could be enough, but honestly it's uncertain and at best probably not working at all in the worst case scenario. There's also Steve from Minecraft using commands, and there's tons of commands and many creative ways that would work against Gojo and remove infinity from the server altogether, but specifically, the kill command should work perfectly fine. One of my friends named Jaesu, who you guys should definitely check out, using a mod called Project JJK, demonstrated exactly what would happen, and it's pretty much over for Satoru Gojo. Yeah, bro got cooked. Kakashi possesses the Mangekyo Sharingan, which would grant him access to Kamui, an ability that creates portals in space which can trap his opponents in another dimension. But not only can Kakashi transport himself and others to this Kamui dimension, but he can also create smaller portals which, when closed, will completely tear off and anything left in its path will be completely disconnected. Kakashi's Kamui ability, just like Gojo's Limitless, is manipulating space. But like everything else in Naruto, there is still a lot of contention across the community. Being blatantly honest, there's really nothing that's stopping Kakashi from using Kamui to virtually erase Gojo's head. Kamui doesn't travel and therefore would never be stopped by the barrier, which infinitely slows things down and stops targets from entering, meaning Kamui would never even interact with Infinity and instead spawn directly on top of Gojo. Some people might argue that when Kakashi visually targets Gojo, he would accidentally aim for Infinity since it's like a protective layer that sits above its caster. When looking at Gojo, you're really just looking at Infinity. This would in turn make targeting just Gojo impossible, but this argument also really doesn't follow. We're told that Infinity is something that naturally exists around everybody, and Gojo just bringing this concept into reality is what makes up Infinity. Because Infinity is always around everybody, it's not like Kakashi can even visually target Infinity even by accident because he can't even perceive it. There are also Kakashis that we see later on that have even better Mangekyo prowess, like the version of Kakashi with 2 Mangekyo Sharingans and a Susanoo. When it comes to dual Mangekyo Sharingan Kakashi, right, he wouldn't necessarily need to use the Kamui Shuriken, but it's fair to mention, since this video is just technique versus technique, that this method probably wouldn't work like the normal Kamui. Like the name would obviously imply, Kamui Shuriken is just Kamui in Shuriken form, and anytime these Shurikens touch their target, they begin sniping off and teleporting anything they make contact with into another dimension. Because these Shurikens would actually never make contact with their target against Gojo, they would probably fail. Unfortunately, you can argue the same thing for other variations of Kamui, like the Kamui Lightning Blade, which according to the databook would transport part of the enemy that is struck by this technique into another dimension and instantly warping them away. So pretty much just like Kamui Shuriken, this variation also requires some form of physical combat, which would be impossible when dealing with Gojo's Infinity. It's not like Kakashi really needs any other win con anyways. The normal Kamui works perfectly fine, and it doesn't really matter that Kamui Shuriken or Kamui Lightning Blade would never touch Gojo to warp him away, but I figured that I would just mention it because this video is more technique versus technique rather than Kakashi versus Gojo.